I never meant to be the kind of person who keeps a running commentary on the neighborhood. But you know how it starts. A tiny thing. And before you know it, you can smell the drywall dust from a busted relationship. My name is Evelyn Park, and Hearthwood Court used to be the kind of place where kids rode bikes without helmets and folks borrowed sugar on a Sunday. Now it's where a single, badly measured fence turned into a county-sized argument. We all thought it was about rules at first. The HOA clause about fences being no taller than 4 feet. But that's never the whole truth, is it? People cloak everything in bylaws until the real reasons peek out. Who wants to be in control? Who felt overlooked in childhood? Who never forgave an insult at a holiday party? I'll be honest. I liked the rules. Structure soothed me. So when Daniel Reed, new to the neighborhood last summer, charming in the way of someone who's both tired and very sure of himself, built what he called a privacy screen that was definitely more than 4 feet, I went from neutral to annoyed without meaning to. It wasn't just that his board of slatted cedar was tall, it sliced the sunlight I'd enjoyed in my yard in the mornings. There was a petty part of me that enjoyed the technicality. The rules existed, but there was another part, quieter and nastier, that liked being right. We did what civilized people do. I emailed, copying the HOA, wrote a note, and slipped it under his door. He left a polite reply on my porch with a little jar of chili lime jam and a note about landscaping choices. The jam was good. That was the thing about Hearthwood. We tried to be neighborly while we sharpened our knives. That jam saved Daniel for a week from the internal committee of judgment that lives in our heads. Then the HOA meeting happened, and everything changed. It sounds dramatic, but you'll see people are small and stubborn, and a single fence becomes a referendum on who we are. The first HOA meeting I went to after Daniel's wall went up was like walking into a church service where everyone knew the same hymn but forgot the tune. Marjorie Cole, our HOA president, had that kind of authoritative calm you only get if you've run 3 PTA boards and kept a home immaculate for decades. She's lived here 23 years, and there was a time I thought Marjorie and I could be friends. We both liked early morning walks and had similar opinions about garden gnomes. Then the gnome incident, another story. But the point is, Marjorie could make people doubt themselves by the tilt of her head. She called the meeting to order like a judge clapping a gavel. The room smelled of coffee and scent-free soap because someone always felt compelled to bring neutral snacks. Daniel sat at the back, looking a little too relaxed for someone accused of architectural treason. There were 3 people on his side. His teenage daughter Zoe, who doodled in a notebook and occasionally rolled her eyes, and 2 neighbors who liked the idea of more privacy. On the other side were the old guard, folks who had their own patch of lawn and their own reasons for objecting to anything that upset the symmetry of things. I sat in the middle because that's me, trying to be balanced until my own opinion slid into something more like ferocity. Conversations began polite, then frayed. Someone mentioned precedent. What would happen if one person could do whatever they liked? Another person said precedent meant nothing compared to a family's right to feel safe in their own yard. I watched Marjorie with a curiosity I'd never admitted. She wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was reasserting a grip. She joked here and there, but there was steel in it. The meeting minutes, she said, would be thorough. When she announced an inspection date for non-compliant structures, Daniel smiled and picked at a loose thread on his jacket. That smile looked like a dare. By the time the coffee cups were emptied and people felt virtuous, the meeting had set two camps: the orderlies and the privacy sympathizers. I felt the first prickle of something like regret, because when lines are drawn, people start arming themselves with reasons. What people forget about HOA meetings is that they make everyone feel smaller before they make anyone feel righteous. After that first session, the group chats lit up like a string of bad Christmas lights, creaks and sparks, and one neighbor refusing to mute notifications. There were messages about property values and civil decency, but under the formalities were the little jabs. Someone posted a photo of Daniel's fence at sunrise, with a caption that read, "Sunset ruined." It's petty, I admit, but there's a power in seeing your grievance echoed back at you by others. It made it feel less like a personal complaint and more like a moral crusade. Daniel, bless him, answered some posts and ignored others. He told one woman that the screen was temporary and they were planning a garden. He didn't say what kind. He didn't have to. Garden sounded like an olive branch. Marjorie scheduled another meeting and suggested a compromise. Daniel reduced the height by 6 inches and plant fast-growing shrubs along the base. Daniel sent a polite email asking for a variance, citing his daughter's need for privacy due to online school and personal boundaries. The language of modern domesticity that sometimes reads like armor. Here's where itchiness turned toward something sharper. People started dredging up past grievances. There was a tweet, not really, but close, about the time Daniel hosted a barbecue that got loud. Someone reminded us of a power washer incident from 3 summers ago that left one driveway blindingly clean and one with a suspicious water ring. Marjorie, in her role as arbiter, listened to every complaint. Her expression was calm, but later I watched her in the grocery aisle, considering whether to buy strawberries. She said, "We're a community," in a tone that suggested she believed it more than anyone, and yet she would not be moved. The meeting atmosphere closed in like a book. You flip each accusation and find reluctance penned in the margins. I began to understand that this wasn't just about cedar slats. People were using rules to tell their stories to an audience, hoping for validation. It's ugly and honest, depending on which side of the fence you're on. Small acts escalate because people hate feeling unseen. Daniel's daughter, Zoe, started getting notes slipped onto their doormat, handwritten, oddly polite, about how lights were left on at 11 p.m., which is a sentence nobody deserves if it's because they were trying to finish a school project. Zoe brought one to me and said, "Who does that?" And I wanted to say, "We do." There's a satisfaction in anonymity. It's the same reason we gossip at garden clubs and leave passive-aggressive post-its about uncollected trash. I told her to keep the note, maybe take it upstairs and tape it to a mirror, because, really, if you're going to target someone, do it with panache. This was where the neighborhood's true colors started to show. Some people stopped waving when they drove by. Others started being excessively helpful in a way that felt like surveillance, offering to take parcels inside, noticing imports of urns or boxes that looked like they contained new speakers. Once, a woman who'd lived here since the cul-de-sac had gravel instead of asphalt came over with an anecdote about how Daniel's late-night laughter, quote, carried across the street. People traded stories like trading cards. You get 3 in a set, and then you find someone to swap with. Marjorie convened a small inspection committee and asked for volunteers. Volunteers are like moths when there's a porch light. They show up in droves but get singed by the first criticism. I signed up, which surprised me. I always prided myself on neutrality, but there's an odd thrill in being an arbiter, even if it's petty. Perhaps I wanted to be present for the fall when it came. We walked Daniel's property like jurors, measuring, taking photos, murmuring about maintenance and aesthetic cohesion. Zoe sat on the stoop and sketched us in charcoal, like a quiet chronicler. During the inspection, I felt something shift in me. Seeing the fence up close, the way it cast a long, deliberate shadow over Daniel's tiny patch of lawn, I had an epiphany. This wasn't only about rule following. Daniel, who came across as unflappable, had put that screen up because he wanted his daughter to feel safe in a world where teenage girls are taught to mistrust strangers and to hide their faces when they walk past men who don't belong in their neighborhoods. Suddenly, the black and white certainties I'd wrapped myself in started to look frayed. We don't talk enough about fear. We substitute policy for empathy because it's safer. That night I couldn't sleep. Maybe that's why I went to the next meeting. The second formal hearing turned into a skirmish, staged by people who had nothing else to do. Not because they were bored, really, but because it had become about dignity. Marjorie wore a navy blazer and spoke with a patience that masked the way she was sort of hungry for resolution. Daniel's lawyer friend, whom I hadn't met before, came and sat with him. It was odd to see a man finally get legal muscle for a backyard dispute. The lawyer's presence did something to the room. It made bureaucracy heavier. More important, like we were finally holding a rotary phone up to destiny. People filed into the meeting room, clutching prints of the bylaws, photographs with timestamps, and at least one page that looked like a Yelp review of Daniel's family tree, written by a neighbor with time for clarity. There were points made about property lines, easements, and the sanctity of communal aesthetics. Someone read a clause aloud in a voice that was trying to be theatrical. And there's always this thrill when someone quotes binding documents. It's like watching someone swing a judge's robe onto a scarecrow. The emotional turning point came when Zoe stood up. She cleared her throat, and for the first time in all these tense weeks, we heard more than a practiced parental defense. She spoke about online classes that meant her face was on a screen all day, about bullies who used GPS tags, and about the way shadows from the streetlights made her feel exposed. Her voice didn't have the rasp of someone trying to be clever. It had the soft, honest edge of a teenager saying, "Please let me be safe." The room did a strange thing. Quiet shifted from tension to something like guilt. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others closed their eyes briefly, as if praying to the house gods they'd made in their heads. Marjorie was unmoved by initial pleas. She asked for compromise again: trim, plant, or relocate. Daniel's lawyer said no. The lawyer spoke in terms of precedent and rights, while Zoe silently folded and refolded a napkin. That scene, a child asking for sanctuary while adults bickered over inches, is what made a lot of the neighbors realize this had moved beyond property values. After the meeting, people left in small knots, whispering to each other, as if we'd all been shown a mirror and didn't like what we saw. People behave differently when they think their reputations are on the line. A week after Zoe's speech, The neighborhood started experiencing a low-level campaign of kindness and exposure. One morning, we found a bowl of peaches at our door with a note that read, "For the early riser who waters the petunias." It felt like an olive branch, but also like an accusation. We were being observed and graded on small domestic virtues. Daniel's fence, meanwhile, began to get attention in other stranger ways. Someone started placing little solar lanterns along its base at night, which made the shadow it cast look deliberate and curated, like an art installation. I began to see people performing their own versions of civility. The Johnsons, who had never talked to anyone beyond a nod, started bringing over vegetables from their garden for everyone to share, which was delicious and slightly unsettling. The effect was twofold. On one hand, it softened the community. On the other, it made people feel watched. If you're generous, you must be doing it to influence opinions. Every kindness seemed to carry a hidden message. I'm good, you're not. At the HOA office, rumor had it that Marjorie was rewriting the bylaws. Rewriting is a euphemism. She was adding clarifications and loopholes that favored rules over people. She argued it was to prevent future uncertainty. I argued with her over coffee about empathy versus consistency, and she smiled like someone giving a child a cup of tea she didn't want to spill. Consistency prevents chaos, she'd say. To her, clarity equaled fairness. To me, fairness sometimes smelled like suffocation. Daniel started leaving little notes on our community board. Not confrontational, just human. Thank you for the peaches. We trimmed our hedges. It read like a man trying to remind us he was neighbor, not target. One night, I found a card in my mailbox that simply said, "Forgive us for being different." It felt like a confession and an apology wrapped together. I didn't know whether to respond. People began to choose sides loudly and silently. In the quiet, friendships were rearranging themselves, and I caught myself counting the people who still waved when I passed them in my car. The social fissure started to affect simple logistics. The HOA began enforcing fines for non-visible trash bins with a fervor that felt disproportionate to the offense. Mrs. Kaplan on Maple Ridge, no relation, wrong street, received a notice because her recycling bin was out an hour too long. The smile she had when handing out holiday cookies turned brittle. There's an intimacy in policing petty things because it's a way to manage anxiety about bigger problems. If you can force folks to keep their bins in the garage, maybe you won't have to look at the bigger moral questions. We started to collect incident reports like people collect stamps. Someone filed a complaint about noise from a DIY music practice at odd hours. It turned out to be Daniel practicing guitar with his teenager trying to bond. Someone else complained about a bird feeder being too close to a fence because it attracted squirrels to their property line. You could feel the absurdity and the righteousness in equal measure. The HOA board, under Marjorie's steady hand, issued fines and directives. People paid grudgingly, like they were laundering their conscience with money. The gossip escalated. There were hints, always hints, about Daniel's past, and people started digging, not by calling him, but by resurrecting old committee minutes and social media posts. It felt like watching a schoolyard reunion where one person is the butt of every joke. I resented the way people turned their curiosity into judgment. At a grocery store, I overheard someone say, He's the kind that just moves in and changes everything. And I wanted to shout that change is often what forces real life into the open. Friends became adversaries quietly. I found a neighbor's car parked overnight at my place once. The woman who owned it later said she had unexpected company, which, knowing our town, meant she didn't want to be seen fraternizing with someone on the wrong side of the fence debate. It was petty and personal. A car, a glance, a hushed conversation. The community felt like it was padding itself with rules to cushion the blow of the things people didn't want to face. There are moments where the pretense cracks, and you see people for who they are. For me, that moment arrived at the summer picnic. We assemble like some awkward chorus every year. Tablecloths parading names of casseroles, people trying to one-up each other's lemon bars. This year had a different undertone. You could feel caution under the tablecloths. Daniel brought a tray of skewers and the faintly apologetic air of someone trying to bake peace. He set them down near the children and tried to talk to folks. Some accepted food with smiles. Others folded their arms and refused. At the picnic, I found Marjorie sitting alone under a maple tree, looking tired. She told me quietly that she didn't want to be the person who turned neighbors into adversaries, but she believed in the rule book because it had saved the community before. Saved us from what? I asked, thinking of the time our kids played in the street and no one worried. She said, from entropy. That word, entropy, made me laugh out loud and then feel ashamed for laughing at the word a woman used to justify being cold. We are always doing things for the future, she explained, and rules are scaffolding. Her logic was tidy. It still hollowed me out. Zoe danced in circles with a small group of kids, and for a moment Daniel looked like any other parent at a picnic. Then someone left an envelope on the HOA bulletin board, a complaint about unauthorized structures and unapproved landscaping. The timing was surgical. Daniel found it and folded his shoulders. I watched his face go from amused to weary. And in that second, I saw how much energy these things take. He could have chosen to fight or to leave. He chose to stay, which made him stubborn in a way I admired and resented. That night, as we dismantled tables and carried away coolers, I felt the community scab begin to peel. Some friendships would not resurface the same way. People exchanged glances that were not quite friendly anymore. The picnic, which should have been a refuge, became a theater for the new social order. I went home and lay awake thinking about how easy it had been to weaponize small grievances. You start with fences and end up exposing the places where people are most afraid. The real damage in our cul-de-sac wasn't fines or meetings. It was the slow erosion of trust. A neighbor who used to borrow my ladder stopped answering my texts. A woman who used to bring her dog over for play dates stopped letting her kids play in our yard. The acts were small but accumulating. Like pebbles that eventually make a path unpassable, you begin to calculate social risk. Who will invite whom to a dinner? Who will sit next to you at a concert in the nearby park? These used to be trivial decisions. Now they felt loaded. I started keeping notes. Not formal minutes, of course, because God knows we had enough documentation, but a journal for myself, lines about who said what and how I felt. Writing it down made the afternoon sturdier. I describe all this like an archaeologist because that's what we were doing. digging up artifacts of people's lives and declaring them to be evidence. In one of those entries I wrote, "We are not enemies. We are scared people clutching rule books." Reading it later, I see that I was trying to make sense of the chaos. One evening I found an anonymous letter slipped under my door, not about fences, but about me personally, a remark about my overgrown roses and unneighborly pruning. The letter was signed with a single initial. It stung in a way I didn't expect because I thought I was safe in my small acts of kindness. I brought it to Marjorie, who frowned as she read it and said, "Investigation will proceed." I tried to be part of a sane process but felt like I was sliding towards cynicism. Marjorie, now wearing authority like armor, asked me whether I'd be willing to testify in a hearing about quote, 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 quote. I felt like a citizen in a very small, very petty court. Meanwhile, Daniel kept being human. He mowed his lawn with an almost meditative patience. He waved to people who ignored him. He painted his fence a neutral color one night, which some of us thought was an olive branch. Others thought it was a mockery because the fence's footprint remained unchanged. In my journal I wrote, "This ugliness will outlast the fence if we let it." The thing about ugliness and conflict is that it reveals people. For some, who they are becomes clearer. For others, it's a hiding place. By then, I could feel the cul-de-sac's original warmth retreating, making room for outlines of people we used to be. Everything came to a head with the vote. Marjorie called a special election to decide whether Daniel's fence would be grandfathered in or forced into compliance. The notice said urgent community decision in capital letters, a rhetorical flair. Everyone who could possibly show up did. People who had live-streamed pasta recipes came and sat in folding chairs as if preparing for a trial. There was a nervous energy, the kind of electric current you feel before a storm. The agenda read like a legal document. The room hummed with the sound of chairs scraping and breath being held. Daniel arrived with Zoe and his lawyer. He chose to speak for a long time about privacy, about the right to feel secure on your own property, and about how sometimes rules lag behind evolving needs. He wasn't theatrical. He was exhausted, like a man who had been drawn through a grinder called neighborly concern. He spoke about his daughter's online work, about threats he'd received before they moved here, about the small ways fear shrinks your life. His voice was steady and low. It was one of those moments where people's shoulders softened because someone had chosen vulnerability over bluster. Marjorie countered with procedure. She read the bylaws aloud and explained why exceptions might weaken the structure of our community for future members. That word structure again, as if the lives unfolding here were architectural elements. The vote was called. We divided ourselves politely, with nods and whispered justifications. Some voted because they loved the look of the neighborhood. Others because they feared setting a precedent that would let anyone ruin the aesthetic. I abstained at first, cowardice perhaps, then voted no because I wanted to believe rules could be tempered by human compassion. When the final tally came down, it was so close I could feel the room tilt. The decision forced Daniel to shorten the fence but allowed for planted hedges to remain. It wasn't a full victory for anyone. The lawyer left with a tight-lipped smile. Daniel, stoic as he was, walked out with Zoe. their shoulders aligned, like a kind of resignation and pride mixed into one. Marjorie wrote to the minutes as if documenting the fall of an empire. After it was over, the neighborhood dispersed like a flock, each returning to their lawns with the added weight of having cast a judgment that would linger on porches and in conversations. The aftermath felt like a Sunday after a holiday, quiet in a way that suggests something has been taken. There were apologies, awkward and late, like someone saying sorry after a party had been ransacked. Some neighbors tried to mend fences in trivial ways, a card left on Daniel's step, a plate of cookies at Marjorie's house, an overly enthusiastic wave from across the street. The gestures were genuine and hollow at the same time. They couldn't mend the things we had said in public meetings or the private digs we made at each other's choices. Daniel started attending fewer neighborhood events. When he did come, people were polite in the formal sense but distant. He taught Zoe how to garden in their backyard, which became a small, sanctified thing. One young person learning to coax life out of dirt while the rest of us measured the right height of our complaints. I began to notice little acts of quiet resistance from people who had been on the orderly side, lending tools more often, stopping by with extra tomatoes, sitting on a stoop and listening. There was a slow, awkward rebuilding, like people putting Band-Aids on a wooden fence. I kept thinking about the cost. We had lost something less measurable than property. The easy trust of waving at your neighbors and expecting the wave back. Instead, we had to think about reputations, alliances, and whether a borrowed ladder was an invitation to friendship or evidence of collusion. The thing about reputational currency in small towns is that it's fragile. One rumor, one petty complaint, and the ledgers are reset. We recalculated social debts like accountants, tallying generosity and suspicion. One evening, I found Marjorie in her kitchen, looking at a stack of letters. She let me pour her tea and listened as I confessed my guilt about having judged before understanding. She didn't forgive me. She didn't need to. Instead, she told me about her own childhood, how rules had kept her family from descending into chaos when they needed scaffolding. For her, structure was love, in the only form she ever trusted. That revelation made both of us quiet. I started to understand that the conflict wasn't only about power or stubbornness. It was about people trying to protect versions of home they'd already lost. Sometimes the most dramatic part of neighborhood conflict is the slow, small redemption. Not forgiveness in a Hollywood sense, but a series of tiny accommodations that add up to feeling less hostile. Daniel planted hedges, as agreed, and they grew faster than anyone expected. Within months, the greenery softened the line of the fence. It didn't erase it, but gave it a reason to exist. Children started to cross the invisible border again for playdates. People who had been rigid softened when they saw Zoe's garden thrive, as if green growth could be a balm for social wounds. Marjorie, too, changed in small ways. She instituted a monthly listening hour at the HOA office, where citizens could come talk without agendas. It felt like a PR move at first, but slowly, these sessions gained honesty. Neighbors came in to talk about real fears, job loss, sicknesses, loneliness. They were reluctant confessions, but they were confessions nonetheless. The rules remained, but the enforcement took on a tone. It was less about punitive measures and more about mediation. I saw Marjorie hold hands in meetings, not physically, but with a softer tone. She learned empathy the way people learn a new language, stumbling at first, then fluent. I, who had once been so eager to apply bylaws, began to see the usefulness of nuance. There was a cost, yes, to making exceptions, but I watched Zoe teach a younger child how to plant basil, and I thought of all the times I'd defended the community at the expense of actual humans. It felt petty and brave at once to admit I'd been wrong about how to protect something that mattered. We started to find new rituals, a monthly potluck that wasn't themed to a letter of the alphabet, a book swap, an impromptu block cleanup that felt less like duty and more like a shared act of repair. But repair isn't linear. There were relapses. Someone would microwave a heated opinion into the community email thread or leave an anonymous sticky note about a loud car. Those small regressions were like scabs that got knocked off. We had to learn the art of returning to civility after each stumble. That was the real work, not making grand gestures, but being willing to re-enter the space where you had been unkind and try again. It wasn't spectacular, but it was honest. The turning point, for me, came on a rainy afternoon when Zoe invited me over to help with a compost bin. She wanted to show me how food waste could become future soil. It was mundane and intimate. She talked about the garden and school and the way her father had been watching the neighborhood like a man trying to find his place. She told me she wasn't interested in revenge. She just wanted a place to make noise when she practiced the drums and a measure of privacy when she was on video calls. Her requests were small and reasonable, and I realized how often we let our anxieties balloon into something monstrous. After that conversation, I started to act differently. I stopped replying to the gossipy group chat with sarcastic emojis, and instead sent texts to neighbors asking how they were. Sometimes they'd answer, sometimes not. But small things shifted. A neighbor I had once argued with over mailbox etiquette stopped by my garden with seeds. Another shared zucchini, like a peace offering. It wasn't a sweeping change, but the small exchanges felt like stitches. They didn't mend everything, but they held the fabric together. I also began to see Marjorie's choices in a new light. She had not been tyrant or saint. She was someone who had made a set of decisions from a place of fear and duty, trying to preserve something that felt fragile. We began to talk more publicly about the difference between rules that protect and rules that punish. Those conversations were raw. People confessed to being brittle, to having been raised in households where power was synonymous with survival. The stories we shared were, in a way, how we taught each other to be less brutal. The garden continued to grow. One night, the hedges shone with little lights, and Zoe, Daniel, and I sat on the porch steps talking until it was late. We spoke about small mercies, a neighbor who'd brought them a bag of potting soil, the hush of snow in winter. It was a human orchestra of simple things that had kept them afloat. In that moment, the neighborhood felt like it might survive its own worst instincts. Looking back, I can see how fragile civility is and how easily rules can become weapons if not tempered with care. The fence controversy didn't solve everything, of course. There were lingering resentments, and some friendships never returned to their old shapes. But we learned something hard and necessary. Community is not merely the sum of obeyed rules. It's the set of relationships that carry us when incidents happen. We learned that the urge to be right can blind us to the cost of being right. We learned that sometimes the people who most loudly defend structure are the ones most terrified of chaos because they have nowhere else to anchor themselves. In the following months, we set a precedent for handling disputes with a mediation clause. It wasn't perfect. No law is when humans are involved, but it was a start. The HOA board created a small fund for communal repairs and mental health check-ins, a kind of perfunctory charity that ended up meaning something when someone really needed help. People started hosting more simple, uncurated gatherings, where you could drop by with a jar of jam and talk about the weather or a bad date. That made me think of how small acts of ordinary care are the true civic glue. I kept writing my journal entries and sometimes read them aloud to myself, shocked by how petty and brave I'd been in moments when I thought I was being principled. I forgave myself in small doses because the story of Hearthwood was, in many ways, my story too. The desire for order, the fear of being wrong, the capacity to change when confronted with real people rather than abstractions. The real ending is quiet. There was no parade announcing reconciliation, no scene with all of us holding hands. Instead, there were mornings when neighbors left jars of tomatoes on each other's porches, and nights when doors stayed unlocked a little longer. Once, in summer, a delivery man left a package at Daniel's gate, and someone we didn't know collected it and carried it to their door without fanfare. Tiny acts, repeated, became our new rituals. Marjorie learned to smile without the chill she used to carry. She still liked rules, but she asked questions first. Daniel trimmed his hedges and taught neighborhood kids about composting. Zoe started a small evening drum circle that, surprisingly, brought people out of their houses to listen rather than to complain. On my last page of that year's journal, I wrote, "We are a community of imperfect people, learning the contours of one another's fears." It felt like a small benediction. I don't pretend this story has a tidy moral. Most of life doesn't. But there's an honest lesson in the aftermath. When we use regulations as a substitute for conversation, we get the emptiness of law without the warmth of understanding. We weaponized bylaws to defend how we wanted things to look, and in the process we almost lost what made Hearthwood home. If you ask me what the worst part was, I'd say it wasn't the fine or the fence itself. It was the ease with which people chose rules over people. The best part was watching folks slowly and awkwardly choose to be human again. We will likely argue again. We will likely invent new bylaws and critique them. But now, when disagreements arise, we try to ask the question we forgot to ask at first. What are we protecting, and at what cost? That question changed everything.